Welcome to Balkans Debrief. My name is Ilva Tare and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Hope stirs in the Western Balkans as the EU councils last week decided to open accession talks with Ukraine and Moldova and extended a conditional olive branch to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Yet cautious optimism lingers. Is this a genuine new dawn or a fleeting spark in the persistent uncertainty? To unpack the EU Council's conclusions, I'm joined by esteemed Balkans expert and colleagues. From Belgrade is Maja Piscevic, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center.
Thank you,
Welcome,
Ilva.
Maja. From Prague, we welcome Ambassador Cameron Munter, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Welcome, Cameron.
Thank you so much.
And from Germany, Valbona Zeneli, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
If you were to sum up the EU Council decisions in a single metaphor, the three of you is a question. What would that metaphor be? Like, imagine the EU Council decisions as a journey for the Western Balkans. What kind of vehicle would they be driving, and what road would be navigating? Ambassador, with you first.
Well, I mean, what I think of is the long march. It's long, it's painful, and it's very slow. Nonetheless, it's always good to see some sort of progress. I mean, I think in the further discussion, we'll get into the depth of what kind of things might change to make it move better. And as we all fear, whether or not the population of the region has the patience for that. But once again, I'd say long march with a lot of blisters on your feet.
I would compare it with an intercontinental flight. So from one place to the other, there's a long distance. That's first. And then, since I said flight, I want to contradict that with train and rails. Because, when you look at the plane and you look at how it flew over your head, you think, oh, okay, it could have gone any other way. But actually, when you talk to the pilots and people who understand, they said they knew exactly where they're going. I hope they know exactly where they're going with the Balkans, but also with the rest of Europe.
Val, how about you? What do you see when the decision was made last week?
Well, my son, I would say like 7 years ago, he drew a picture on the EU enlargement and he had cars running in circles. But I'd like not to use any metaphor because we use too many in the region. And if we're talking about the last EU Council meeting, I am an optimistic in the sense that enlargement is still there. It's important for countries in Eastern Europe. I think it's very good news that accession talks were opened for Ukraine and Moldova, and I think that's keeping the enlargement process alive.
I agree that the EU Council decision, especially to open negotiations after some challenge that they have internally with Ukraine and Moldova, it marks a step forward. But is it enough to sustain this new momentum we have been talking in 2023 for the Western Balkan accession, or there is still significant hurdles to overcome before reaching that new European stage? What's your opinion, Ambassador?
Well, I think that it is not sufficient. I think that we need to what we would call widen the aperture. And as I think others who are on this call have heard me say before, I think it's not enough to leave it to the EU. I would like to see, for example, more look at beyond economic and other institutional things towards security issues, and see if there's a role that NATO could play, to see if we look to the historical precedent of how other enlargements have worked, it could be pushed forward by external efforts of other institutions to push forward. That is simply to make it a bigger thing than just an internal European process. The reason for this is that seems to have gone on so long and become so arcane, I think that it's difficult to drum up support for the process.
That's important. Maja, in your view, is this enough? This momentum that seems to be continuing with Ukraine's and Moldova opening negotiations, and not much happened on the Western Balkan front, especially on Albania and North Macedonia. What should be done to keep this momentum on?
Well, what I'm most afraid of right now is exactly this momentum, and the fact that we have just a couple of months ahead of EU parliamentary elections. We have different elections upcoming in the world, concluding with the US elections in November. So there is really just a little bit of time for the big reforms that have to happen both internally in the EU and in terms of expectation in the Western Balkans. What I am really grateful for this declaration is for stating clearly that rule of law will be of essence and that the process will be reversible and that countries have to be fully aligned with EU foreign policy, which was a message directly to Serbia, I would say. So some parts of it sounded they were written directly as letters to some of the leaders in the region. And really encourage that at least a narrative boldness that we have seen in this document for, I would say, for the first time.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I believe even more that Europe is at an inflection point, and it's important not just for security and integration of the Western Balkans. In this case, we're talking about the region, but it's important for the security of Europe. We have seen that since the end of World War II and since the creation of the European Union, enlargement has been the most important foreign and security policy tool that the European Union has had. So European Union cannot and should not lose that. And so for that reason, I think it's not enough. It's not enough in the sense that both in the EU institutions, in EU member states, but also in the Western Balkans, we need to change the narrative. It's about having a vision, and it's a vision of a free, prosperous, and united Europe. And if we will not achieve that, if the Western Balkans will be left outside, we cannot talk about that vision. And it's about an economic and security vision of the European Union of the future in this world of a renewed great power competition or strategic competition. But one point, Ilva, I think that we have been watching all these processes and meetings, and I think for the Western Balkans it will be more important what happened in between those meetings than exactly what we'll see in the declarations, because they are in the path of EU integration. So I think the tools and mechanisms that will be used during the time between summits will be sometimes even more important. And my last point has to do with perceptions. And so we are hearing now, I think, the perception was that it was not fair. It was not just with the Western Balkans. I believe that we should not allow those perceptions and those narratives that are pushed also by malign actors to take root in the Western Balkans, because we know that the objective is very clear. The countries will get there. It depends on both sides on how quickly they will perform on, when the date will be. But I think the process is much more important than when the countries will become members of the EU.
I agree. It is a tango that is going on between the EU and the Western Balkans and the new accession candidates. But since we're talking about this, do you see any willingness from the EU to reform itself, to reform the EU enlargement process? Let's say to introduce qualified majority votes during the process and use unanimity only to open and close the negotiations. Will we see this happening in the next months, Ambassador? What do you think?
I really don't know if there's that kind of energy. I would defer to my colleagues, I think, who watch that more closely. Um, I would love to see it. I would love to see an idea that there is a new spark, a new feeling. I think rather that what we're caught in is the kind of, you use the word tango, and let me use the Argentine model here. That you've got a guy in Kosovo who wants to be Che Guevara, and you've got a guy in Belgrade who wants to be Juan Perón, and you have a country then and a couple of countries that are being driven down by this element. And it's very hard when you have this kind of attitude to excite the people in Europe and to excite especially people who are non-specialists in Brussels to get excited about this when it seems to be such a morass. So I defer to my colleagues, but I'm skeptical.
Because Maya, there will be another Orban or more requests from Orban, or will be another Bulgaria during the process. Can this be this hurdle, this obstacle, be overcome by reforming the process?
Listen, I think that one of the most positive news that have come from the EU is that it realized that it needs to reform and it needs to enlarge, and not doing that for anyone else's favor, but because it needs it to survive. And on one hand, so we have the realization that those things have to happen. Now the question is how fast, how deep, and that's where we see too many differences, I would say, at this point. And the timing is not really favorable. Of course, we have to remember, which is funny because even Krastev mentioned that the other night in Vienna, when he talked to us, he said, don't forget that the EU is not a country. And I was thinking, like, yes, maybe we should be reminded from time to time, but it should look more like a country than it does at certain times, especially like when you mention Orban on or some other statements that come from the EU. So yes, I think that EU is aware it has to change. The biggest step is changing the unanimous voting to qualified majority, but there are many steps and many smaller changes which can be done even without changing a treaty. And my hope is that these things will start happening even before the elections, because if they don't start before the elections, it might be, I don't know what too late means, but it will be late.
Too late. What too late means for a non-country. Val, you have been an advocate of introducing the qualified majority votes. Do you see it happening?
Well,
Will the EU vote for
I
that?
hope so, but hope I know it's not a plan. I believe that it's very important because the European Union is a dynamic institution per se. It has changed. It started with 6 countries, and now its enlargement might get up to 36 countries. So it is needed for the functioning of the European Union to move towards a qualified majority voting. And even more when it comes to enlargement, considering that many of the countries have still some bilateral issues that need to be cleared, they cannot, countries should not stop the process and prolong, reforms both on the side of the European Union, but also on the side of the Western Balkan candidate countries.
Val, my question that I've had about this is that I sense that this is a cross-cutting issue that could, and to mix my metaphors, and the Balkans could get caught in the crossfire, that there are smaller countries who favor a more robust approach to the Balkans, but who are afraid of qualified voting because they're afraid of being outmaneuvered by the big countries. That is, as small countries, they would lose something. Do you sense that Europe, this is not just a question for the people who want to see enlargement versus the question who don't want to see enlargement, that there's lots of cross-cutting issues that could get in the way?
Well, absolutely. I believe this is going to be very difficult at the end, and you have to have unanimous voting from the very beginning to take those decisions. So I believe it's going to be, but maybe we will have some, we'll have some more other tools where, like in the case we saw the case of Hungary and Ukraine. So abstention in this case was considered as one of the ways. So maybe we can be just creative out there and maybe. Yeah,
Creative.
absolutely. So I think that's the key word that European Union needs. It's about competitiveness of the European Union. So in this word, if we don't take decisions in a much faster pace, we're going to be the losers.
Yeah, I would
Maya.
say that, one of the ways to overcome this legal boundary is gradual accession, actually, because that's where the things can start changing and the countries can start participating, integrating, citizens can start feeling the benefits, provided that the governments engage in the reforms. And this is where the voting system will not affect necessarily each side of the process.
Albania and North Macedonia did not get a date for the intergovernmental conference. The phrase used by President of EU Commission Ursula von der Leyen was as soon as possible to open the first fundamental cluster. What do you think will happen there? What are the chances that the negotiations will start officially, Ambassador?
Well, I think that they have to make themselves take part in the kind of changing the topic that I think Val was mentioning, the new narrative. That is to say, if it still becomes a battle to keep talking the way we've talked the last 10 years, I don't see that other countries, other leaders, and other people who have real challenges are going to pay attention. It has to become that broader question of, if we don't move ahead, if we don't bring the strength that you have to convince us that North Macedonia, Albania, and others will bring to the Union, we're going to be in trouble. And that, to me, could be partly a question of the politicization of Europe. It could be the economic strength of Europe. I don't know how that new narrative works, but I guess my short answer is, using the same narrative, I don't see how these guys move ahead. The narrative does have to change.
And you might just follow up. I would say that there is a lot of scapegoating when it comes to the European Union, and so I think that's not even healthy in the countries of the Western Balkans. We know that the entire enlargement fatigue has also created reform fatigue in many countries, and we have to accept that. So I think sometimes it's easier, even for leaders, just to give the fault, just to scapegoat the European Union for the slow process of enlargement. And so, going back to what Ambassador Munter said, we have to change the narrative. It's not the EU pushing the countries to reform. This is a parallel process of state building, democratization of the region. So I agree.
I will quote Prime Minister Rama, who answered to one of the questions when in the debrief that we had a couple of weeks ago about the losing faith in the EU, and said we cannot lose the faith in the EU even when it doesn't do what it said. Because we simply don't have any other choice. And I think that somehow I use that quote in my own thinking about the EU. I really think that these things have to happen, not only for Albania and North Macedonia, but for the progress of all the Western Balkans countries. And I just hope that it will happen sooner rather than later. But we must never forget the huge volume of work that each of our countries has to undertake in the meantime.
Bosnia, there was a conditional path to negotiations that requires significant reforms. Do you believe that the country can overcome internal and political divisions in order to fulfill the necessary degree of compliance, as the EU Council said, Ambassador?
What stuns me about this is that, I look at Albania, I look at North Macedonia, and I see the likelihood of having the political will and the political coherence to deal with these kinds of things is much greater than in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think everyone wants to be able to say they've done something good for Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I am skeptical that the institutions as they are now configured will stand up to the incredible burden that they have, which is why, once again, it's so sad to see North Macedonia and Albania be the ones who are not at the door when they, in my opinion, have much more capacity to make those kinds of changes that are necessary. So, yeah, I'm doubtful for Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Maja?
So hard to talk about Bosnia. So hard to talk. I'm afraid even sometimes to think about Bosnia. I mean, one positive thing I could say that it always looks as it's on the verge to collapse, and yet it hasn't happened yet. So I hope, if it's really in that position at some point, with the good and the right push from the inside and outside, it could just prevail in the right direction. And I think the EU has a great role to play there.
Maja, the lack of collapse is faint praise.
Val, on
I'm afraid
Bosnia?
that sometimes when we talk about security issues and lack, of improvement, sometimes it might even become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, I would like to get away from just, discussing Bosnia's security, the future, as important for the future of the Western Balkans, security of the Western Balkans, but also move to prosperity. And I believe that the main security challenge for Bosnia today is not just inter conflict in the country, but it's the young people that have left the country. And if you talk to Bosnians everywhere, they want to see a different countries, which the politicians do not allow. So I think this is where we need to focus more and be more creative, even in this case, and focus more on the youth of the country. Because enlargement process for a very long time, even in Eastern Europe, has been focused on leaders. And that has to change. It has to be focused on society, civil society, youth, business communities in the countries, because those are the forces that will drive the country forward.
Montenegro, the new government presents apparently a new opportunity to solidify the EU's trajectory of this country. What concrete actions can Montenegro government take to build upon this new momentum and ensure a long-time commitment with the EU? Do you see that happening so far with the new government, Ambassador?
I don't. I confess that I have not. I'm not the expert on this, and again, defer to my colleagues. One thing that is just a problem is that because Montenegro would be in many ways, it seems, the easiest country to let in. After all, it's a member of NATO. After all, it is small and digestible. There are reasons why it can probably be done through sleight of hand, but I don't sense yet that there is and this is maybe as a result of malign foreign influence. I don't sense yet that there is a strength or momentum in the country that can get us past that hurdle.
Similar to Cameron, I want to be confident, and I keep saying that Montenegro should be a case where EU should increase and could demonstrate its credibility and its interest in enlarging. It's a small country, NATO member, no bilateral issues, solid economic numbers, and has a new government with not perfect, with some weaknesses, but if we wait for a perfect case candidate, I'm afraid that might never happen. So the cost of this would really not be too expensive, I think, and giving them some effort and benefit of the doubt could send a strong message to the entire region, including the countries which really lag down in reforms.
Well, I believe the fact that we now have in this competition who gets first into the EU, also Ukraine and Moldova, and maybe further down the road, Georgia in the future, I think this is a healthy competition. I think that if countries look at each other and see, who's going to be the first one to join the European Union, that means that we'll see more reforms in the Western Balkans. So I maybe, I will you know, uh, disagree a little bit with my colleagues because I think it's not on the EU. I think this case it's on what the government in Montenegro or what the government in the other countries of the region will do, because the EU has been very clear in a complete Zeitenwende. Change of language, of diplomatic language, that enlargement is a political priority. And I think it's not just for the Balkans, but this is important for the EU itself. The EU is, I think, looking more than we are for a successful case study in the Western Balkans, because that is what will keep the process, which will be much longer, I believe, with the other countries in Eastern Europe open. So they're looking for a successful case study, and it should be the governments in the region that offer that.
And there should be a competition now. Who will be the front
Competition.
runner? Used to be Montenegro and then North Macedonia. And the ambitions are going high from Albania as well now. So we'll see who's gonna get in that position.
But
Kosovo and Serbia, I think the most important issue.
one
Yes.
point, Ilva,
No.
it's very important that whoever the country will be that will get first in the EU has to have a clear alignment with the EU's foreign and security policy. That is very important because we are talking right now about issues that we already see in the EU that are pushing some of the member states to look for qualified majority voting. So that has to be clear from the very beginning.
I agree. Kosovo and Serbia. their EU path is linked with the dialogue process, and it was made clear again in the EU Council conclusions, also asking for the implementation of the Ohrid Agreement, uh, saying, also emphasizing that this is a legally binding agreement for both countries. Maya, I'll start this with you. How did you see the conclusions on Serbia and Kosovo from the EU Council?
The thing I like most about the conclusions and the declaration is that it concludes that the fates of Serbia and Kosovo are inextricably connected and tied up, and that one cannot move forward without the other, or blocking the other, not without the other, but by blocking the other. So that's, if that is not a motivation, or if that is not a credible threat, to be more precise, I don't see anyone else that could change. Now, given the history of this dialogue and all the disappointments that we have seen, no one can guarantee that this will work. But this is, I really believe, what EU should have and has said, should have done earlier, and should implement to its full force.
Val, what do
Well,
you think of the formulation of the request for Serbia and Kosovo?
well, I mean, it is clear, as Maya was explaining. I believe that we have not seen in the past such a clear language, and actually, this has brought backsliding, I would say, even in terms of regional relations, bilateral relations. So it's time to do that, and we should continue like that for the future. The language has to be very clear and honest and open. Otherwise, it will be translated in different languages, or even within a country, it will be translated into different ways from different political parties. So I think it's time now that the leaders should not hijack the process with the blame game, story that we have seen, for the last 2 decades in the Western Balkans.
Ambassador?
Yeah, I'm glad I didn't have to lead that one off because I always am the pessimist here. But I think that Valbona's last point is the key one. That is, as long as this becomes a question of the personalities of Alexander Vucic and Albin Kurti, it's going to be pretty difficult. But there are other powers, other forces, other impulses in these countries. I would say, especially civil society, especially the business communities, um, who can realize this and can work with their counterparts in Europe to try to move things ahead. The over personalization, what I referred to earlier as the the Che Guevara, the over personalization of this has run into a dead end. And I think the creativity here is really fleshing out what Val has suggested, making this a broader process that brings in more players who are not simply as difficult as these two.
And there is a very important economic aspect in this convergence into getting closer to the EU. There is a EU market access, a common regional market that Maya knows, and Val and Ambassador Cameron here at the Atlantic Council, we have been promoting and talking about enhancing regional cooperation. And then there will be the access into the EU single market. All this will be possible through investments and EU funds and the growth plan that EU Commission has presented. Do you believe that the doubling the economies of the region in the next decades, which is pretty ambitious, is even possible, Maya?
I'm not sure it's possible, but I'm not sure that is even the most important at this point. If this process with gradual accession and admission to certain segments of the single market takes place, I think it will be such a positive message for the entire region, but also for the investors coming from the EU and the US, that this will drive the process forward, regardless of the amount of funds directly invested by the EU. So opening the doors, changing the mindset and saying, okay, let's allow these guys to come in if they on a merit-based criteria, I think that that would be even more important than doubling the GDP or the amount of investment come from the EU.
Ambassador?
Well, I would get back to the components. We talk in abstractions about this economic growth, but the point that Valbona made earlier about demography is one that is, one of many pieces that I think it would behoove us to talk about, rather than. It's not wrong to talk in general terms about economic growth or about economic, broader infrastructure and other kinds of questions, but the specifics of how people are living somehow has to be grasped here, because I think that the impact in Bosnia is the worst, but not the only example of this kind of crisis of the way people are living. That has to be addressed in a certain way. I'm not saying these will be easy, but I would get into those elements of specificity if at all possible.
So a good point, and I'll still go back to the fact that it's important, to change the narrative even here. So it's very important, first of all, for the Western Balkans that are offered this four-pillar growth plan. And that's what I said at the very beginning, Ilva. That's not what happens in the summit declaration. I think what happens in between summits, such as, we're expecting now a more detailed format, a framework of this growth plan, that's even more important for the Western Balkans. And I will say that two are the most important events that have had a positive experience for people in the region, and that has been the visa liberalization process. And in my opinion, if it's done right, it will be this four-pillar growth plan, because that is what needed for the economic convergence of the region with the Western Balkans. I would even say that there is the potential even there to double the GDP of the region in 10 years, in one decade. It is more than possible. And because we're starting at a very low level. And so there's going to be a lot of, attraction or possibility for attraction of investment, which is much needed in the region, that can bring about sustainable economic growth. Now, on the other side, this is important for the European Union. That's what I said. We need to change the narrative, because this has to be part of the entire strategy for increasing competitiveness of the European Union, economic competitiveness. And all these ideas of de-risking, nearshoring, that is where we need to focus on the Western Balkans. That's how we need to increase the chains, the production chains, and bring them closer to the European Union. And the region will be a perfect place where to have that. And so we talk about nearshoring, but you have, friends, ally shoring, with so many NATO countries being part of the Western Balkans. I think that will be where the safest investment for the European Union will go. So definitely, I would say that it is very possible. And in this case, the Western Balkans will not just be a problem, as we unfortunately see for the European Union, but will be part of solutions, from de-risking to energy solutions, energy diversifications, and other important issues, climate change, green technology transition. All those are very important elements that, if done right in the Western Balkans, will really change the perspective of the region.
Let me add here also that the audience for this is not just people who make things and want to start making things closer to Europe. Of course, these people matter, whether they're people building components for German firms or people putting together pieces of cars. Part of this, when you go to the discussions that take place in Vienna, Berlin, London, at the venture capital and the banking and the big financial institutions, you don't get the specificity of talking about the Balkans, not only in its, as a geographic place where you can do business, but its political importance for the future of people like BlackRock, like Chase Manhattan, like Deutsche Bank. That is to say, the audience for this de-risking discussion, this green discussion, all of the things that Val mentioned, this has to be brought into a bunch of new rooms, not just people, again, who make things, but people who pay for it. And those people, my experience is that is not yet happening. That those people, as they think about the broader question of de-risking with China, don't in the next breath think, oh yes, and the Balkans. And that would be a wise thing for people like us to encourage.
I appreciate all your valuable insights, and thank you for discussing together the EU councils on, especially on the Western Balkans. And wish you a happy New Year and happy holidays
Thank you.
Thank you.
to
Thank you.
everyone.